Nick?
Alberto.
I'm not doing this.
So, what happens when any pendulum swings to one direction?
I'm not a physics professor, but I think it just stops right there and stays, right? And then everyone just forever that's the way it's going to be, right, Nick? Or did I get that wrong?
As I understand it, that's how pendulums work.
Yep.
However, in this instance, let's just take a hypothetical pendulum that swings to one direction and then with equal velocity swings the other direction. And it kind of just keeps doing that.
Oh, okay. I see. This is where the doctor of physical therapy has a biomechanics component, which has a physics component, which maybe means that actually might be the way it works. We don't do that in S&C. We just say something. We just like chew, nicotine gum and then comment upon which athletes look like they're slow twitch or fast twitch, and then about it. Yeah.
That actually came from the fact that I have a grandfather clock that was given to me by a family member. And if you actually understand how a grandfather clock works, it's really amazing. There's no power, there's no batteries. It's just the energy of the pendulum, which is mind-blowing to me. But anyway, today we're not talking about grandfather clocks or nicotine gum. We're talking about muscle length training and training at long muscle lengths. It's something that anyone in the space has come across probably multiple times, but I think we're going to have a bit of a different take on it. Today, we'll probably talk about how we practically use this information. We know that there's something to it, but have we drastically changed our training? Have we changed it at all? And how does it fit into pain and injury? And maybe another way to modify a movement to work around some pain or a sensitive joint or something like that. So maybe, I guess, Alberto, you, anyone that follows you, which is mostly everyone on the entire planet, you've kind of changed your training technique a bit, maybe your philosophy around training technique and different angles of pull and things like that. Why don't you kick us off and just kind of tell us, like, when you were first exposed to longer muscle length training and how you kind of have digested it and put it into your own training.
Yeah, man. Well, I think first of all, what I do to a large extent at this point in my career, it's going to be largely experimental. Like, one thing the lockdown showed me is that, like, once you've had muscle long enough, like, your body just kind of keeps it around. Like, I hardly trained during lockdown when I really stop and think about it. And I think I downgraded to like 80% of what I was. And then, like, within 2 weeks, it was just like the muscles were flat. Like, I'm like, okay, that wasn't nearly as bad as I thought. So it's hard to lose muscle. And for me, it's really hard to gain muscle. So for me, it's almost worth taking, like, just turning stones and trying to, like, do whatever I can to just move up to that next level. Because I mean, it's a good position that I'm in, where it's like, okay, I can compete with some of the best guys out there. But at the same time, like, the best guys out there, like genetically speaking, like, the difference between them and me is just, there's a gap. There's a huge gap. Like, I can't get away with just being consistent. Like, I have to look under, I'm always open to, like, feedback, ideas, like, and the source, if it makes sense, it hardly matters. So for me right now, I've been doing a lot of that. Like, I'd say about 80% of what I do focuses on, like, hey, let me find what the muscle length is, what is the stretch position for this muscle. Spending some extra time with the pauses there, which I think the best part, even if this doesn't win, the best part, and you'll be able to speak on this, is the fact that things that hurt don't hurt nearly as much anymore. Like my elbows, like, by slowly kind of working into, like, this used to be my lengthened, like, tricep. And then over time, I've been able to, like, really lengthen it. and spending more time there. Like all of prep last year, like my elbows were like at 80%. So good enough to train, but I had to be very careful with them. And just that's been like great. It's like my knees, my ankles, my shoulders, like everything feels amazing. So, for especially lifters, they've been lifting as long as I have, like the bottleneck quite often is like your orthopedic limitations, right? So it's kind of reinvigorated my joints. That's been very useful. So yeah, a lot of this is kind of, it's a well-calculated risk. It's like, I know I can't really get worse so long as I lift weights. And like, at the same time, it's like, hey, let me see if there's something there. Cause like I said, with these guys, like I was comparing Madden scores. Like if there was a Madden score for genetics, I put this up on my Twitter. I'm like a 78, 82, probably more like a 78. A lot of these guys are like the stuff that 90s do. It's like everything they don't listen to this podcast. Like the things they do, it's like, this is a meme, but that's actually like what you do and you look amazing. I'm not going to say his name, but I've been right next to one of the best bodybuilders on natural bodybuilders on the planet. This dude cut water like a day and a half before the show, and he just looked vascular and full, could barely talk because his mouth was all sticky, and he just looked peaked out of his mind, and he hadn't even started to pump up. Mind you, he crash dieted to the show as well. So like that's what I'm up against. And to me, it's like, okay, let me take what I can to see like if it works. I did that with refeeds a few years back, and right now this is kind of my flavor of the week. But I think for most people, man, it's like you got to keep some fun element in there because you're going to progress anyways. And like whether it's optimal or not, like you're going to make progress. Like enjoy those years. Like everything doesn't have to be perfect. And what ends up happening in hindsight, most of the time, it's like you thought you were being optimal, you thought you were being perfect. And then the next flavor of the week comes up that says that like, okay, that was mildly wrong. So even when you think you're being perfect and optimal, you're not at the end. So yeah, people shouldn't be doing what I'm doing. They have to view it from like the context of like my situation. I'm a bodybuilder that's stuck. Like I'm stuck. Like I can look the same for the next decade very easily, but at the same time, it's hard to make me look worse too.
Well said, man. And I think that's actually, this is not on the topic of long muscle length training, but that's something just for people to be aware of when they consume our content. And hopefully we do a decent job of talking about it from the coach's perspective, from the scientific perspective, from the general perspective for novices, intermediates, advanced, etc. But I think if you consume your typical fitness content, or it's kind of this assumption like, oh, I'm going to just emulate someone I like whose physique is cool, who's an influencer or an athlete, and therefore I'll do that. And they actively advise you to do that. Here's what I do, works great for me, blah, 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 click link in bio. Nothing wrong with that. Well, there is. I'm being too nice. That's not a good approach, regardless of whether it's us or them. And I really appreciate, Berto, you being more transparent about like what you're looking at is me on top of 20 years of training, trying to make my physique change. And for one, to your credit, your back totally transformed for this last season. And I think that's something that is quite an achievement at your stage of development, and was inspiring for me. If you are, I don't know how Madden scores work. I don't care about sports. I just like lifting weights. But if there's a gap between you and the genetic elite in bodybuilding, I'll just say that there's a gap between me and you, and then I'll let people figure out what that means as far as my gap between the elite. So I'm in a similar position. I have been lifting for, this would be my 19th year of lifting. And for those who are watching on video, you might see some weird shape on top of my couch on the top left of my screen. That's the calf boot. So, I mean, I think the only difference between you and I, Berto, is not the interest in being innovative or trying new shit. It's where do our primary inspirations come from? And mine are in like, preprints of papers and conversations with other academics primarily. But that's not to say that I'm unwilling to try or not open to, more in the trenches experimental stuff. But anyway, point being, I'm right there with you. Totally get it. And that's actually something that I've added to my training as well. And I am curious as to why you don't feel as much pain. And my first thought is that an interesting thing happens when you train at longer muscle lengths. Is it also shifts the length force curve a bit. So that sounds super scientific, but it basically means like at what muscle length are your muscles stronger, right? Because the typical idea and the way we understand force production is that when you're at a really, really elongated position, you can't produce a lot of force because the sarcomeres are stretched, so there's less cross bridges. And likewise, when you're in a really, really shortened position, there's too much overlap past the point where they can form cross bridges. They don't produce force. So there's what's called the optimal length tension relationship. If you want to, you have to say it with that accent too, okay? Or you get kicked right out of the conference. Or politely asked to leave because no one's going to kick you out when they have that kind of voice. And so the optimal length tension relationship allows you to produce more force. But that is malleable. It's changeable. So your body, there's adaptations that allow you to produce force better in those positions. And it makes me wonder if shifting, that curve a bit, maybe it provides more joint stability when you're lifting, or is a little more quote unquote protective, or something. I don't know. But Nick, correct me if I'm wrong. From your wisdom as having a professional doctorate, not one of these bullshit PhDs like I have, where we talk about who's slow twitch and who's fast twitch. I would love to hear your take on that. If you think there is something going on there, because I know obviously like more muscle injuries happen when tension is higher at a longer muscle length. So I mean, kind of in a broad perspective, we could just say, hey, doing that probably is more protective against injury, I would think. But it's also a higher injury risk. I think that's something people have a hard time wrapping their head around, that dichotomy.
Yeah, I never actually thought about that aspect of long muscle length training, although I think I implement it without knowing it. I think what it comes down to is we're just exposing the joints and soft tissues to load at those ranges of motion for longer periods of time. So if someone has pain, hamstring pain, and we do loaded RDLs and we have a pause at the bottom, the more that we can load that tissue in that lengthened position and just expose it to it, get accustomed to it, desensitize it, the better. I think the injuries at long muscle lengths are probably not a slow, controlled Romanian deadlift with an appropriate weight on the bar with a 3-second pause. Usually we're talking about like a high acceleration or like a change in direction or either like a ballistic movement maybe. So I think we could take that concept to any body part, like the triceps, like Alberto said. If we keep exposing the elbow and the shoulder to those lengthened positions and keep loading them and loading them, it's just naturally going to give us more range motion at that joint. Just like my favorite hamstring stretch is a Romanian deadlift for the same reason. You get deeper and deeper and more range of motion as you keep loading it in that position. I think one of the exercises that I've implemented this type of thing with is a push-up. So I have the like the wedges that I put my hands on, kind of like Jeff in his garage, and I just kind of pause for like a good 3 seconds in the hole, just to kind of hang out there, just to sit, just to make a connection with my chest. But also I'm exposing my shoulders to an end range position. I'm stretching the pecs out in that position. So yeah, I think there is value from just a pain desensitization standpoint for hanging out in those long muscle length positions.
Yeah, I would agree. And it's been my experience somewhat as well. Because I'm not doing probably as much as Berto is doing, but certainly I would say my back and my shoulder training and my leg extensions, which is kind of a function of my equipment, and then realizing, oh, that's why I got sore in the middle of my quad after I started doing standing leg curls. Also, fun fact, which got shared with me by one of the dudes at Natty News Daily, figured out a way to jury rig, I should say, a seated leg curl on a cable stack now, so I can actually get in the lengthened position on leg curls too. But anyway, so I have absolutely noticed that there's been some of that as well, even though I'm not doing as much as Berto, and I think that's interesting. Going back to the introduction that you had, Nick, with the pendulum concept, I think it is important, and one of the takes that we're going to have on this is just kind of pointing out what we don't know. And I think the reason why Berto explained, and correct me if I'm wrong, Bert, hey, I'm being experimental, I'm trying new things, is to make sure people don't think like, hey, look, this is established. Like, this is the way pros train now, okay? If you're not going to long muscle lengths, what are you even doing in the gym? You might as well just, like dump your protein shake out and just put yourself in a full body cast. Nothing does anything. You got to train. No, like, we're not saying that. And I think the analogy of the pendulum, and Berto's little disclaimer there, is to say, or what I can support that from a scientific perspective, is this is pretty damn new ground. And it's anytime we're on the edge of innovation or understanding something, it's ripe for excitement because we don't have data saying, yeah, it's a small effect size, which is probably what we'll find. We have some data, don't get me wrong. There is actually enough for a meta-analysis, not specifically on muscle lengths, but with sub-analyses on partials at long muscle lengths. But ultimately, we're at the early stages, and we don't fully understand the mechanisms involved, which I think is important. Because when you don't fully understand the mechanisms, you can kind of hypothesize and make something sound legitimate either way. So I'm going to play a little fake pseudoscientist game here with y'all, okay? So here's the thing. So we have data. We now have a meta-analysis that suggests that partial range of motion training at long muscle lengths is actually better than full range of motion training. So therefore, what you probably want to do on all of your training is go into the deepest stress position you can and do like 5 to 10 second pauses there. And that's most likely going to enhance your hypertrophy. Then we're going to stop, rewind, and I'm going to say something totally different, but it's also going to sound legitimately scientific. So we have data on long duration static stretching that without even a contraction shows that you can actually gain muscle size from this stretching, showing that the passive tension component to muscle is actually a really important contributor. So while it's important to train at long muscle lengths, you probably don't want to pause and have that dissipation of the passive tension go away, because that's probably additive to tension. When you actually do a stretch shortening cycle and you go from an eccentric to a concentric, you're actually producing higher levels of force and therefore tension on the passive structures, which through costomeres and of course the tendon are going to transfer to the rest of the muscle as well as the titin molecule. So just because we've learned this stuff about long muscle length training doesn't mean that we should be implementing long pauses. Now, you're probably wondering which of those is true, and the answer is I don't know, and nobody does, to my knowledge. So we're still trying to uncover whether there is like a different mechanism between the stretching or the training at a long muscle length, how that interacts with full range of motion training. Is it the tension developed at a long muscle length or just the actual exposure? It's probably got to be a little bit of both to some degree, right? So from a scientific perspective, yes, we have solid data on this. Just to for the nerds out there, there was a recently published, it was a preprint for a while, meta-analysis and systematic review by Bilo Wolf, who's doing his PhD on this topic, along with James Steele, James Fisher, Brad Schoenfeld, and Dr. Pack, titled Partial versus Full Range of Motion Resistance Training, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. And they specifically had an analysis where they compared, partials to full range of motion training. And they found that shortened length, like shortened partials, like doing a quarter squat, was inferior for hypertrophy to full range of motion training, something we've known for a while and we have a lot of data on. But there was actually a small effect size in favor of partial ranges at a long muscle length compared to even full range of motion training, which is kind of groundbreaking. So that is interesting. There's a few, there's like 6 studies on that at the moment, which sounds like a lot, but it's really not. And ultimately, just because we know this is a thing, we don't necessarily know what's the best way to practically apply it. So I'm going to leave that preamble there, Nick. But when does that all make sense to you? And how do you conceive of this in this early stage?
Yeah, I think the way that I look at it, and like you said, there's just we don't really know the details of why, right? The way that I look at it is, if I'm going to implement a change in something, then I would like to know two things. I would like to know whether the new thing is going to work, but also, is the old thing not working? So for years and years and decades, people have been building incredible physiques, training like we traditionally would train, doing barbell squats, doing seated leg extensions, doing lying leg curls, all exercises that perhaps aren't maximizing the lengthened position of every single muscle. It seems to be working though. And I can't see a future where, even if we tease out the details of this, the physiques are going to be completely different, out of this world, improved than the physiques with traditional training. I don't see that happening. What I take from this is, maybe we can make some small changes to certain exercises to bias the lengthened position if it's available to you. So, for example, in my own training, I train in my basement. So I don't have a full gym. I'm limited on equipment. I use a resistance band around a beam in my basement to do tricep press downs. If you look at that movement, when my tricep is in the lengthened position, the tension is the least on the band. As I press and get to we can call it the ineffective part of the range of motion, then the tension gets heavy. So knowing this information about muscle length training, I just kind of squat down on the band at the top position, so I get some good tension there, and then I slowly rise up when I extend my elbow. So I'm not just throwing the exercise out. I'm just modifying it a little bit just to enhance the lengthened position. With leg extensions, once a week, I do them lying flat back on the bench, so I get a bit more of a lengthened stretch on the rectus femoris. I don't completely throw out the seated traditional leg extension, because there's probably something that works to it that builds big quads. So I'm not overhauling my training. I'm just throwing in little sprinkles of this stuff until we learn more. And then if more and more stuff comes out, maybe I'll throw in some more sprinkles in my training. But not everyone has the means to perform a lateral raise for your shoulders at a lengthened position. I only have dumbbells, so why not use the dumbbells for lateral raises? I don't feel like I'm at a disadvantage because I don't have a cable stack to do a lateral raise in the lengthened position. So I think that's important to remember, is that it's not that what we're doing is not working. And also, there may be other benefits to the shortened position as well. So just off the top of my head, I have no idea if this is a thing, but if we look at a curl, and we look at the muscles of the arm that flex the elbow, that bend the elbow, we have the brachialis, which sits underneath the bicep. And no matter what position your shoulder's in, your forearm's in, that brachialis is going to bring that arm up because it attaches to the ulna, which doesn't rotate at all. The biceps can be impacted with forearm position, with shoulder position. So if we're only training at the lengthened position for a bicep curl to maximize tension on the biceps, perhaps we're losing out on some brachialis growth, because maybe at the top of the curl, when the bicep is at a disadvantage, maybe the brachialis kicks in more. And if our goal is to build a bigger arm, not necessarily an optimal bicep muscle, if our goal is to build a bigger arm, maybe there's something to a full range of motion curl. Because the studies that we're looking at usually are looking at certain muscle groups and muscles that are growing with these lengthened positions, but they're not looking at overall thigh development. And maybe something like a seated leg extension may not be optimal for the rectus femoris, but again, I don't know, but just hypothetically, maybe it's better for one of the adductor muscles. That's very important for an impressive thigh on stage in a bodybuilding competition. So I think there's more to figuring out what's optimal for these like 2 joint muscles. And maybe we can look at the whole physique development, and maybe there's more to it than just always trying to focus on the lengthened position.
I would totally agree, and I think there actually is data to support that. When you were talking, I was looking up the study to make sure I got it right. But there's a 2020 study by Mayo, and it's relatively well known. It's a study where they compared the lying versus the seated leg curl, and kind of the primary findings that are getting talked about are that the hamstring growth was better in the seated leg curl group compared to the lying leg curl group, even though they had the same number of degrees of range of motion. So now it's the same range of motion, but because they're in this like sit and reach position, the hamstrings are more stretched. But what people don't point out very much is sartorius growth was better in the lying leg curl position, which when you think about it, the sartorius, for those who don't know, it's kind of that cool strap-like muscle that attaches from the front of your hip down the side of your leg. And if you know how to pose your legs, you can make that really pop and look good and front relaxed and thigh, etc. So anyway, that is a knee flexor of the sartorius, among other things. It's also a hip flexor because of where it attaches on the front of the hip. So it is actually stretched when you're not in hip flexion, but you're in hip extension, like you are more so in a lying leg curl. So if you want overall bodybuilding development, you need to do both, right? Or you just need to do other exercises that might train the sartorius, but you get my point. So there already is data, actually, Nick, that supports exactly what you're saying. You don't have to do that goofy thing I did earlier where I gave these two both sciencey sounding things that honestly, they weren't even that convincing. Like, oh, stretching works really well, so don't stretch for 4 seconds. Yeah, I would I don't buy it either. But the point is we don't know. And I have seen a lot of other posts from people involved in sports science and biomechanics and functional anatomy who are interested in this. And some of them have really leaned in hard to like, hey, let's go full long muscle length training. But I think probably the better takes are the ones that are saying, let's hold the horses. Even when there are arguments for why that might not be a good idea, I do or don't agree with them. In principle, I agree with them that we shouldn't just go full lean into this just because we don't know what we don't know. I've seen people postulate that, hey, certain muscle groups are designed, quote unquote, from the perspective of they produce more force and they're more engaged in these shortened positions. Like for example, the glutes or the delts. You could make an argument that from a functional perspective, which may or may not apply to hypertrophy, you see higher levels of force production, and they're in a better position to produce torque in a short position. Like I said, that's not necessarily a convincing argument to me because performance and hypertrophy aren't necessarily the same thing, although they can be related, but we don't know. So ultimately, you're 100% right. It's not like the thing that Dorian Yates and Ronnie Coleman did to develop their back was training at long muscle lengths. Probably the main thing they did was have the right parents, but like Dorian is known for basically standing almost upright and like kind of shrug humping the bar into his hip crease and calling that a Yates row. And the only reason why anyone ever accepted that as a reasonable movement is because he has these huge lats hanging off his back. And I know all of our UK fans right now just threw their tea at the wall and they're very mad at me. But nonetheless, and then they're like, hey, now you made a joke about tea. Like, I'm coming for you, bro. When you go to the Sheffield, I'm taking you out. Sorry, guys. Just suck it up, Sip it up, I should say, your tea. So anyway, point being, it's like we do have some anecdotal in the trenches experience that suggests, yeah, people are growing muscle okay without completely going full long muscle length. And that is never an acceptable counter argument to something. But what anecdotes do tell us is that whatever these high-level people were doing, it was sufficient to allow them to become a high-level person. We don't know if it's optimal, but we know it wasn't so bad that they could not grow a back, right? So I think that's just an important thing to remember. It doesn't mean we can't improve. It doesn't mean we should just only do what the jacked people of 20 years ago did. But we can know that long muscle length training is not going to change the game because the game is pretty well established, but it could be something worth exploring. But there are potential downsides. The data right now does indicate to me that training at short muscle lengths doesn't provide any additional benefit, at least when we look at single muscles. Like, see differences in proximal versus distal growth, but unfortunately, when you train at a full range of motion or include the long muscle length portion, you seem to get both proximal and distal growth, not just one or the other. So anyway, all that is to say, I don't have a strong argument why you shouldn't train at long muscle lengths, but if you don't understand your anatomy well enough, you may not always be at a long muscle length for every single muscle that you think you're at when you're dealing with some of these biarticular muscles. And there is, the jury is relatively still out as to some muscles potentially not benefiting from this as much, or maybe even benefiting from different muscle lengths. I don't know. But I think it's fun to experiment with it. And I will also say that some of you who are earlier in your career of lifters should have a different perspective to Berto. You're probably not in a position where you can do anything and not regress, so that experiments are less costly. If you're only 50% of your way through like reaching your potential that you can get in the next 10 years, that can be time wasted if it is, maybe a little too extreme or a little too gimmicky. So don't use that as an excuse for program hopping is what I'm saying.
Hey everyone, this is Andrea Valdez popping in real quick to tell you all about our latest course in the 3DMJ Vault titled Personalizing Your Program. This course was made by our Chief Science Officer, Eric Helms, and it's honestly the entire foundation of how to assess, create, and manage training programs for bodybuilders, powerlifters, and serious lifters of all types. Eric will spend the first few chapters teaching you about the 3 pillars of training adherence and how not considering any one of them will lead to decreased performance or results. And the last half of the course will give you insights and advice on how to manage your program through life stressors while participating in other types of non-lifting activity, what to do when you miss a workout as an off-season athlete, how to handle missed workouts as a competitor with a deadline, and how to conceptualize goal management and injuries. The course is full of the advice that nobody really wants to hear until they've run into problems, can't stick to their training schedule, have ruined relationships, or fallen short of the plans that they had for themselves. It's the backbone of every athletic career, and it's what we wish athletes knew before ever lifting their first weight. But since most people skip these steps or lessons, it's where most setbacks in progress or confidence can happen. We know this course will serve as a solid foundation or a solid set of reminders for lifters of all levels, and we can't wait for you guys to take it. Personalizing Your Program is now the 19th course in the 3DMJ Vault, which is our online learning platform of organized video-based education for serious lifters. You can become a VIP member to access every single one of our courses for just $16.99 per month or $79.99 per year. This means that once you complete this foundational course, you'll have access to everything else you'll need to build your own training program with these lessons in mind. You'll have access to our Quick Start PDF guide, along with the entire 40-plus videos in the lifting library, so you can select the right exercises to fit your newly built training plan. VIP members will also get access to our suite of nutrition setup courses as well, such as the Calculating Your Calories course, the Calculating Your Macros course, the Sustainable Fat Loss course, and many more. Go to 3dmjvault.com and sign yourself up today. That's 3dmjvault.com to get all access. Thanks so much for listening and enjoy the rest of the show.
A lot of what I'm doing, like I run my experiments on like athletes that are like in similar situations. So I have like Dirk and Brian, but these are like 2 like really like world-class guys that are in a similar situation where it's like, all right, like instead of just limiting it to myself, let me try it on you. Because again, with them, it's like they're gonna look great regardless of what they do, but are they gonna get better? So that's the question. And where it's honestly, I think where it's kind of like myself, where it's been the most useful has been in. I mean, by the time you get to be an advanced athlete, you have quite a bit of mileage on the joints. Like, usually you can feel the 20-something-year-old you like all over your body. So it's made it so that we don't have to lift as heavy, while not necessarily jeopardizing the amount of tension that we expose the muscles to. that's really valuable because you get to the point when, especially like with these guys, where they're that specialized, where it's like they really don't care if someone sees them, hitting 130-pound dumbbells on the incline. They just want to become better bodybuilders, and they want to do it in the safest way possible. So, yeah, with my more intermediate guys, it's a combination of, we throw a little bit of that in there, here and there. Mostly for like an anatomy lesson. It's like, hey, did you know that like you want to stretch out your medial delts? It's like, hey, these are your options, but for the most part, it's like, hey, let's pick the movements that you feel the most competent with, that you feel when you perform these movements. I took this one from Ben Escrow many years back. It feels like it's you against the weight, not you against the weight against your body. Because, at the end of the day, I think most of us can attribute like the biggest spurts we've ever seen in muscle mass to some like really objective changes in your performance output. Like you got significantly stronger. You added reps over the course of time. When I go back and I look at my physique and like, when did I see like those spurts happen? It's like when I added 20 pounds over the last 4 months to my dumbbell presses or something like that. So with those folks, it's like, hey, it's like that's the key. That's the key. So who cares if, I don't know, this leg press doesn't put your quads in as much of a lengthened position as this hack squat, but the hack squat kind of gives you trouble. Like once we're like 4 weeks into it, it's like, let's go with that one and let's get really strong on it. And this is probably your best bet for right now, because big key to making long-term progress is getting to those advanced levels with as little limitations as possible. So yeah, like my advanced guys, like, because I think that's who most of the people who might be tuning in might be like, oh, Dirk's doing this, Brian's doing that. But, again, very, very similar situation to my own.
Alberto, can you repeat that quote about pushing the weight or lifting the weight? What was that?
Oh, yeah. No, a good movement. Like for you, it feels like it's you against the load, not you against the load against your body.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. I guess think of Giannis like trying to squat. Like it'd be him against his body more than the load. So, yeah.
So I shoot archery, and I've shot archery my whole life. And there's a saying that says, too many people think that they shoot the arrow, but they shoot the bow shoots the arrow. And I think that kind of just stuck in my mind and like makes me think similarly to what you just said. And about getting a similar effect with less load. I mean, that's at a certain point, that is the goal. If we can get the same effect with less weight, and we don't care who watches us train with the 130s and the incline press, like why would we not do that? Similar to BFR, right? Like if there's a way to train with light loads and get a similar benefit, it may be better benefit. Why not give it a whirl? And one of the ways that I kind of use this in therapy for someone recovering from pain is just another modification to a movement. So if we're trying to rehab a pissed off patellar tendon or pain in the front of someone's knee, perhaps we'll stick with movements that don't go to the lengthened position, because those are the most challenging, right? That's the most challenging position usually, is that fully lengthened position. If we're getting someone back into movement after surgery, we're going to start with just like a little bolster under their knee to bend it to like 30 to 40 degrees and have them do some just knee extensions like that. We're not going to put them on a leg extension machine, have them lie back flat and fully lengthen their rectus femoris and have them do a knee extension, because just the mechanical load to that is just intense for someone if they're not ready for it. So if anyone is thinking of trying some of these positions, first, like Eric kind of alluded to before, get a good understanding of your anatomy. That will help guide you. But then the other thing is proceed with caution. Definitely try just like If depending on the modality of the exercise, if body weight is not possible, just the machine, like just get in the position and just see what it feels like to really stretch that muscle under load and just do that partial. Because if you dive right into it too fast, you could really set yourself up for some pain if your body's not accustomed to that and not adapted to it. Something like a reverse Nordic, where you're in like a tall kneeling position and you kind of just lean back, keeping everything straight and kind of like just angling your whole body back, hinging at your knees. That could be really, really a drastic change to your quads, to your hip flexors, to your patellar tendon, to your knee, to your patella itself. So not that they're bad movements or bad positions, but if you want to make sure that you're adapted to those positions. So one of the ways you can do that is just slowly kind of work into it. So with that reverse Nordic, maybe first you hold on to something and just kind of lean back, or maybe you put like a couple pillows on your heels or something and you lean back, or you let yourself hip hinge a little bit back, like just to get a feel of what it's like. As you're going back, you'll feel your body like hold on, wait, no. And like maybe just get to that first point of like resistance, like when you feel like, oh, this is uncomfortable, like sit in it for a bit and then come back up and then kind of keep revisiting that until that like rebelling from your body kind of calms down a little bit. So key point is, if you're going to get into these positions, they're not bad, but they are an intense stretch under load. So if you're planning on doing that, just make sure that you go gradually, because you don't want to dive into something like that. And one other example of a patient that I recently treated, he was having knee pain at the mid-range of a knee extension. And on stairs too. It was like when he when he did the top portion of like a knee extension, he felt okay, and the fully lengthened position, he felt okay too. But there was something about the middle point of that range that bothered him, and that was the same on the stairs too. When he fully bent his knee on the stairs, it felt okay, but then when he was right in the midpoint, he had pain, and then when he did that terminal knee extension to bring himself up on the step, then it felt okay. So what we did for that patient, and he had other goals other than just growing a thigh for a stage. He wanted to play basketball. He wanted to play volleyball. He wanted to just be an overall resilient kind of guy, right? So what we did was we worked the leg extension machine in the lengthened position. So we did partials in that portion, which was pain-free. And then we skipped over the middle part of the exercise, and we just did the top portion. Not like in the same set, like 21s, like back in the day, but we just separated it into different exercises. And then what we also did was I had him. This was in the summertime, so he was doing a lot of like walking and stuff outside. I had him just go on a curb and keep his affected leg foot on the curb. And he just would bend down off the curb, tap the heel with his opposite foot, and then come back up and squeeze his quad nice and straight. And he would do that little step down again, come up and squeeze his quad again. And that's the shortened position of the quad. But if we're trying to get this full knee pain-free, I think there's benefit to training kind of both of those extremes in that instance. So, yeah, I think the message to all that is just, if you're going to do it, gradually work into the positions. And the shortened position, the lengthened position, they can have benefit if someone is recovering from pain and injury. And remember that not everyone's goal is to just grow a muscle. Sometimes you want to make sure that they have exposure to every portion of the range of motion.
Well, those are bad people who don't want to just grow the muscle. That's my first thought. No, but in all seriousness, I like that we're getting in the practical now, because I think we could spend some good amount of time talking about that. Unless, Berto, you want to talk more about big picture stuff before we start diving into that. Anything you got on that topic?
No, just when you talked about Ronnie and Dorian, like with the rows, like man, I'll be the first to admit that I think a lot of the muscle that I put on in that area was kind of regrowth to some extent. And I kind of grew up with that era and rowing that way, and it was fine until it wasn't. And when you think about it, it's like I can see, because I'll every like 3 weeks or so I'll throw in something where it's like, okay, I'm rowing and it's a weight that's heavy enough that I'm like losing range of motion, right? And I'm like, wow, this is kind of sort of what I was doing before, but the ego, right? I was like, let me get it up. So it was weight that was definitely challenging the lengthened positions of my back, but it was a very inefficient way of doing it. So when I look at those guys, it's like, okay, that's kind of sort of what they were doing, but it's fine until it isn't, basically, like that sort of deal. So for me, it's like, okay, I'm doing that again, but now I'm like actually letting, like, the range of motion that I am getting is like, it's only being done by my back and not like a combination of, like, you know, my spinal erectors and my hips and my knees and like everything else, basically.
Your soul.
So yeah. When I look at it, I'm like, oh, I mean, you can see some evidence there. Like for example, people who, when they perform any sort of squat pattern, just based off like how they're put together, it's like their quads are in a very lengthened position. They happen to have great quads, you know? And like you look at guys with big barrel chests, it's like, whoa, dude, as soon as he unracks the bar, like his pec's already lengthened, right? So there's a little bit of that. But, you know, again, kind of going back to, this is where, like, I'm so thankful that I was exposed to the powerlifting world, because, you know, for most of these folks, a lot of the powerlifting movements, like, I'd call them like, they're on average like a 7 out of 10 when it comes to, like, is this the best thing you can do to grow like the prime movers? But like USAPL, like warm-up room, like you go back there and you'll see hamstrings, you'll see glutes, you'll see pecs that you're like, wow, all these people are getting like insanely strong with, like, I don't know, like these bronze medal movements, right? And that kind of goes to show you, it's like, okay, figure out ways to get stronger. And I think above anything else, that's still going to be the thing that's going to drive the most, like, progress. And even right now, that, like, a lot of my training is biasing this, the stuff that I'm making progress on, like objective progress on, is the areas that are growing the most. So, namely, like my triceps, obviously they were like kind of injured, but I've like, it's been objective progress, like load and reps. So, you know, at the end, if I give a movement, it doesn't feel, you see me doing the lateral raise and you feel like something's getting stuck as you do it. It's like, dude, just go find a lateral raise machine, you know, do dumbbells, but do them right. And if you progress on those, like, you will make an insane amount of progress. I sometimes wish I could take bodybuilders to the back of like a big powerlifting meet, and I could see these drug-free lifters, and it's like, bro, they got, like, you have dudes doing all these cute, like, pec fly, like, variations and things, and like, if they saw these guys' pecs, or like, you know, like the gals that are trying to, you know, get their booty game up, it's like, she fucking deadlifts, and she deadlifts sumo, and look at that. So, you know, at the end, it even if it's optimal, if it's just uncomfortable for you, it's like pick the stuff that you're most likely to be able to do for a long time. Just like we preach when it comes to anything else, like when choosing your caloric deficit or whatever it might be. It's like whatever you can do for a really, really, really long time consistently, that is what's going to get you the bulk of your gains. And for me, obviously, the bent over barbell row wasn't that's a prime example of that, where it's like it was good till it wasn't. So, yeah.
I love it. No, that's great big picture perspective before we jump into some of the kind of the X's and O's and the hands-on stuff. No, I agree fully. I think, yeah, this stuff doesn't change the game, and it shouldn't change some of the principles we follow in training. And I think we've talked about this before, or at least I have, that one of the things that I'm not fully bought into is the idea that now that we need to train at long muscle lengths for certain exercises, that we didn't previously do that, or at least the point where tension and the difficulty of the exercise is at the hardest, this is a shortened position, like for back work. Now, all of a sudden, we need to do like forced partials and, training past what we would typically consider or previously have considered failure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think we just need to think about that. Like, okay, so how do we implement this? And I found a really, really easy way to do it is just to change the line in the sand where I decide what counts as a rep. So for example, that way I can still maintain the same RPE goal, the same rep target. I can choose a load that's similar or appropriate for how many reps I want to get, just simply with a different range of motion minimum requirement before I go that was or was not a rep on a cable row, right? So the way I do it now, I used to be very strict because that's just my personality. It's like, all right, if I can't touch my palm to my abdomen, it's not a rep. So if I didn't quite touch, that's 9 reps. And I did 9 at a 10 RP or 9.5 RP or whatever, right? So now I've just simply changed it to, all right, if I can't get 2/3 of the range of motion, then it's not a rep. So you'll see this decay in range of motion throughout the set. But is that a big deal? No, because I'm actually spending more time in the lengthened position and maybe getting a little more out of that. And when I think about it, I never had back DOMs. Like that was something that I have never previously had, and I'm actually starting to get back DOMs now in this very late stage of my career. Hopefully that means something in terms of growth rather than just I get to be sore sometimes now. But I think that's probably the easiest way to do it. So this stuff, it sounds complex. I talked about sarcomeres. We've been talking about needing to know anatomy and where the sartorius attaches and stuff like that. I can understand if you're like, you know what, I want to do this, but I'm kind of checked out or I'm kind of intimidated. But it's really not that hard in my opinion. Is basically that's one way with back work. I think it's very, very useful. Another one, like if you have equipment limitations, you can work around this as well. Nick was talking about, like how he's just changing the way he does band push downs. But there's easy ways to, like if you do lateral raises with dumbbells, just attaching a band, to something at a downward angle from the arm you're lifting, so you can kind of stretch across your body and do a lateral raise. You can do the same thing. That's probably even better than a dumbbell. Ideally, you would do it with a cable, so you have similar, resistance. I think that's another really, really easy one is just change from dumbbell lateral raises to cables. Don't worry about stretching your arm across your body or behind your back or whatever. If you can comfortably, fantastic. But if you think about it, all of the dumbbell lateral raise tension occurs as you get into shorter and shorter range of motion. So simply switching to cables is probably a novel enough stimulus for most people, in my opinion. So those are easy. Then another one, like I already mentioned with the seated leg curl, don't switch fully over to seated leg curls, but do both. Do seated and lying leg curls. I used to hate seated leg curls just because they were uncomfortable. Like too many things to adjust, and it made me shift around in the seat more than a lying leg curl. It made me feel like it was me against the weight against my body. But now that I do them more regularly, they're fine. So I think once I became aware of this data and I started putting them in there, you think about what's the appropriate parameters of how to perform an exercise. And the fact that I'm squirming a little bit when I'm trying to get my heel close to my butt, I'm kind of like, well, does that matter? Because that's like that shortened position. So if I'm performing the first 2/3 or 3/4 of that range of motion and I'm in a solid position and I'm good, and then I get squirmy to try to complete the rep, I now understand that this doesn't mean as much. Berto, that actually reminds me, I have a vivid memory of training with you, AJ, and Levi at 24 Hour Fitness in maybe Castro Valley? I can't remember where. But I was having just like that personal trainer, like bullheaded, you're doing this wrong moment while you guys are doing dips, because you were not locking out on dips. You're just doing like the bottom half and just pumping out like 40 of them. And it just looked so bro-y to me. And I was like, I can't do this. Like, lock out your fucking elbows. You're doing tricep extension. You're not extending your triceps. Triceps will never grow from this. And looking back, it wasn't true. It was fine. Maybe better, So it's just, I think a lot of how we perceive exercise execution and form is based upon some of these like quote unquote objective standards that are not really that objective when it all comes down to it. They're just what is done and what looks right to us. And I think once you start changing the parameters of what you're trying to accomplish, then all of a sudden you can feel differently and perceive differently, different form that you would have thought was good prior, which I have found is a very interesting experience. Like it's probably good that I train it at home now because I don't have to worry about what other people might be thinking when they see me. And then, it's Eric Helms. I don't get to go to gyms and I'm typically recognized when I go to gyms, and that sounds arrogant, but I don't like that because then I can't just focus on what I'm doing. I have to think about, what do people think when they see my training? They're thinking this is what I should be doing, or this is scientifically valid, or something like that, or this is what I use with my athletes. And, I don't want to be scrutinized in that way. I just want to be able to train, because I'm an athlete too. So being able to train at home and do lateral raises where I'm only getting with a cable my hand up to around my lower ribs when I'm close to the end of a set, that's not something I would be as comfortable doing in a commercial gym, So the point there is just that when you change the parameters of an exercise and you think about training at a partial range of motion at a long muscle length, it's going to feel weird and it's going to take some acclimation times. And I think you should probably slowly incorporate these things. Like I said, switch from dumbbells to cables on lateral raises, right? Incorporate lying hamstring curls. Allow yourself to do most of the range of motion, but not all of it before you call it quits on your back work. And I think if you just did those few things, you would probably get most of the benefits of everything we're talking about here, because most of the other muscle groups, it just doesn't apply, Like Berto gave the power lifts a 7 out of 10. I think if you remove deadlifts, we're back up to an 8 or a 9 out of 10, in my opinion, depending on how badly you arch on bench. Because a squat, it's great. You get all the vast thigh muscles in a very lengthened position if you're doing to powerlifting depth. And a bench press for people who don't have crazy arch capacity, you're typically getting a deeper pec stretch than you are on dumbbells, because the dumbbells, as you get stronger and stronger, those are going to hit your chest earlier. But the bar, you can actually get deeper and hit your chest. And if you have a massive arch, then that changes, of course. But most powerlifters I know are doing variations anyway, where they're doing more flat back or feet up or closer grip to get that same increase in range of motion. But I digress. You do squat and bench and RDL, and you got basically a lot of benefits for most of the muscles in the body. And it is really just kind of these outliers, like the hamstrings, the rectus femoris, and the lats and the delts. And a lot of the times I don't think people need to worry about this too much beyond what that little list I just kind of gave. I don't know. Do you guys feel the same way?
Yeah, I think one thing that there's an argument for them being ranked as high as you mentioned is the fact that there's standards for those lifts, and that encourages people to be progressive. Because again, that is so important. If you get your bench at some point in your lifetime to the mid 200s, you're going to have some pecs, man. So I do like that about those lifts, that you're influenced by what other people are doing, I think, in a mostly positive way.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. I think the progressive overload is the piece there, rather than necessarily the exercise selection. But yeah, I think that's just something, again, it just comes back to the concept that understanding this, the idea that long muscle length training enhances hypertrophy, doesn't change progressive overload. It doesn't change, proximity to failure. It doesn't change volume or understanding of it. At least we don't think so thus far. And incorporating it into a way that is relatively synergistic and seamless is probably the best way to do it, instead of kind of jumping on something that is a little more gimmicky or that is like an overhaul, because we just don't have the confidence to warrant that yet. And conceptually, it doesn't make sense that we would need to either, in my opinion.
I think the term range of motion degradation is that. I think that
I like that.
I think that perfectly.
Ron decay.
That and then how you said you're just objectively changing the definition of a rep. That perfectly sums up how I have been approaching this whole thing. I think, just like you said, in the past, I've been very strict with my technique, and that little voice inside my head is saying that doesn't count. that wasn't a full rep. And I think that's probably how I've implemented it in my training, and how I probably see it's the simplest way and the most logical way we can do it at this point. is just changing the definition of that rep. And maybe if we don't get that full squeeze of our back on a row, we just continue to hang out with that load for another 2, 3, 4 reps until we really can't pull. And then I've even just kind of hung out in that lengthened position, just holding the weight for a couple of seconds. I don't know if that's doing anything, but it makes sense that it does, and it feels great. So I think there's a lot of that too. Like, we take these principles, we take these concepts, and we roll with it, and we see what feels good. And like, hey, who knows if that's gonna be beneficial? It's probably not gonna hurt, but what the heck? Like, we'll give it a shot. That being said, like, I've been rowing for years and years and years. So like you said before, Eric, like, I don't usually get sore in my back, but if you are getting sore with a normal row, then perhaps don't experiment like in these positions and don't keep trying to prolong that rep. Like, if just because they're kind of advanced, right? You may get very sore if you do this stuff too much. But yeah, I think that's probably the way that I kind of go about this. But at the same time, like, it's about enjoyment too, and what feels good. And I'm not going to lie that at the top of a curl, if I squeeze my bicep as hard as I can, it feels good. I feel better connection in my bicep. I get a better pump. I feel more of that like metabolic burn. So I like that position. Is that fatiguing my bicep unnecessarily? And am I getting less volume in the lengthened position? Maybe, but I mean, I don't know. It feels good to me, so I'm gonna keep doing it unless something really drastic comes out and Eric tells me not to do that. Then I won't do it anymore. But no, I think with anything, kind of circling back to how we started off with what Alberto was saying, like, you take your information from everywhere and then you put it through your filter, and what works for you, what feels good mentally, feels good physically. And you kind of roll with it and just do it and progress and see what works for you. And this is a journey, right? It's 3D muscle journey. It's not 3D muscle workout or 3D muscle exercise. So you learn as you go, and we're all still learning, and we're far from perfecting this thing that we're doing. So, and that's the joy of it. So just, keep trying different things as long as it's nothing crazy and really against what the evidence says. Kind of come up with what works best for you, and keep your finger on the pulse of what's coming out and start trying to implement some small things here and there. But ultimately, like we've been saying, it's not going to make or break anything. From a bodybuilding standpoint, from a physical therapy standpoint, it's just another idea in the toolbox of ideas that we have to throw at our training.
Well said. And one thing I would like to add is we will have more interest soon. So like Nick is saying, is watch this space. I am excited to announce that I am part of a multi-site data collection that is comparing long muscle length partial only training in trained individuals to full range of motion training. So that'll be a really cool thing to see, because if there are certain muscles that do grow and certain muscle groups that don't, or if there aren't differences, then or if there are differences, those will all create a lot more context and answers to this question and help us better understand, where we might have been reaching too far beyond the data, or what, okay, we need to look at muscle specific protocols, or that gives us some idea at the mechanism behind this. Because ultimately, if we can understand why we're observing what we're observing, then we can implement these approaches in a way that is in alignment with that, rather than doing something that might actually be contrary to the actual mechanism. So I am typically just about like, hey, if it works in an applied training study, if this group got bigger, let's just do it, and who cares about why? But I think this is one of those cases where there's enough potentially conflicting mechanisms and there's enough anatomical differences where we should have a little more clarity on why what we're observing is happening.
Practical takeaways. Just one really quick thing before we close this one out. I think a good way to just keep some balance, like, across your training for now, as a just in case, and keep those movements that challenge the muscle groups in a more shortened position. one thing that, I mean, I still use them a lot with athletes, and usually it's a good way. Well, first of all, the person has to know like what is the lengthened position for said muscle. But so okay, you know this, and then so what is the fully shortened? So sometimes starting off with these fully shortened movements before you get into the lengthened position really helps you find that lengthened position. So one of my favorite combos, for example, it's like what's it called? A glute a bridge thrust, and then we get into RDLs. So just like one lighter set in the, say, I don't know, 10 to 15 rep range. So it's like you do those, and then, hey, all of a sudden people become better hingers, and they can really find that stretch because the movement before really challenged it in its most shortened position. So another sequence I like to run, for example, is like the dumbbell lateral raise, and then from there, and I make sure the person keeps it like above their navel. It's like going to like, you guys ever seen Arnold do those like inclined dumbbell lateral raises where they're kind of going across his body and they kind of just barely break parallel. And it's a lot easier for them because that movement, like on your own, is kind of tricky, even if you know what you're looking for. But when you do a shortened bias movement first, and then you follow it up with a lengthened, it's a lot easier to find that. So yeah, first you're gonna have to do your homework, figure out like what the lengthened position for said muscle group is. But starting off with some shortened, it's like, hey, it kind of fulfills that criteria. It's like you get some of that in, and it's gonna make finding the lengthened position a lot easier. And obviously there's things like backwards, they're kind of all included. It's like it starts off shortened and then eventually it just becomes mostly lengthened. But yeah, that's where I found the most utility in the shortened movement is that they're a guide so that when you move on to the lengthened stuff afterwards, it's a lot easier to know what you're aiming for.
Well said, Berto. I think that's useful instructional advice. And I actually really like the, not the full like Serge Nubret lying on the ground dumbbell lateral raises, but just setting up like an incline bench at like
An incline, yep.
and then just kind of putting my shoulder against it and sitting sideways on it, then doing lateral raises with a dumbbell and just getting it up to, parallel to the ground. Then you basically, it's hard right from the initial movement. So if you don't have access to cables, if you are training at home and all you have is adjustable dumbbells, that's a great way to do that. So yeah, I think this has been a really good discussion. I think we've said everything that we have to say, at least at this time. And yeah, Nick, you did the intro. I'll do the outro and just say thank you very much for following along with the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. Give us a rating and review where you can. Typically, people leave 5 stars, and that's what we'd recommend. But you have the freedom of choice, at least the perception of choice, which may or may not be real in this simulation that we all live in. And we will catch you next time, every single insert date here on the 3DMJ podcast.